Happy Friday, my mayhem makers. It's another crazy Friday as usual, nothing new. Um, we are doing half square triangles today. Generally half square triangles are fairly easy, but the pattern directions do it for what I would call kind of a mass production way of doing it. And it's not my most favorite way to make them because the edges become biased because of the way they're created. So I'm going to show you two methods for doing half square triangles today. I will show you the method and the pattern. That way, if you're doing a lot of them and you don't mind bias and all those kinds of things, it's definitely a great way to get 4 half square triangles done at a time. Otherwise, the method I usually do gets you 2 at a time, but you don't have bias. And definitely better for this pattern if you're not doing a large volume or you don't mind just doing about twice as much work. So I will start with the patterns method because it's fairly simple. I think I have pieces ready here. It's been kind of a crazy afternoon as usual. So what you end up doing, of course, I didn't leave myself a demo piece. It's been a long week for us. So glad it's Friday. You're going to have your background. My background is this really fun kind of acid lime, and then a square of whichever color you're doing. So for mine, in my pattern, I had to go and make sticky notes. You know, I told you I love sticky notes because I had to count out how many half square triangles of each color, and then there's some even here, if you can see. So I had to go through kind of make a list. So if you're doing different ones all the way around the butterfly, what probably is easiest, what I did is I went back and referred to the lovely pages 13, 15, and 17, each of the sections, because it will tell me in each section how many half square triangles there are. And so I looked at the section, I looked at my drawing, and just started counting out how many of each kind so I could make sure I got the appropriate number of each different colors. Fortunately, my drawing for the most part only uses 4 colors, but then in the middle of mine it has, if I can get it to stand up, this kind of rainbow version, which I had to modify because of my background being the bright green. So I had to make sure all my colors contrasted with my background. If you have not picked your background yet, this is the time that you probably want to do that. Otherwise, you're going to be skipping this step until you do pick your background, because this is the only block that actually uses your background fabric. The rest is all in setting. So it is necessary for this week's steps to have your background available. So if you're not ready, that's okay. You'll be able to refer back to this video later when you are ready. But since, silly me, didn't leave a square of each, you're going to take one of each, put them right sides together, and then you're going to sew all the way around. See if you can see this. So you're sewing a 1/4 inch seam all the way around with it right sides together, okay? And so essentially encloses everything. What will happen is then, I don't have my fancy other camera going today, you're just going to cut it in half in the diagonal, and I'll show you what it looks like. So you're going to have your square, cut it on the diagonal one way and the other way, just like if you were cutting 1/4 square triangles for setting blocks and those kinds of things. So what happens is then they'll come apart. Let's see if I can have enough dexterity. So you cut it apart and you magically have 4. You press them open and then trim them. So something to mention, if you have not already cut your fabric, if you haven't gotten ahead of the game, that's great. That's the whole point of this, is for me to tell you all my tricks and things. I did actually cut my fabrics larger. I like to give myself too much and trim down so that I don't have to worry about any wonky edges and whoopsies and all those kinds of things, or my seams getting too big. So I actually cut my background and my prints that it says, I cut them 4.5. That way I have plenty of room to trim. 4.5 definitely gives you just lots of space to work with. So if you have not cut already, any of those half square triangles that you're trying to do in the mass produced method of sewing all the way around and then cross cutting, just do 4.5. If you've got enough fabric, just cut it big so then you can trim them down because they are just little 2.5-inch square triangles in the end. Just these cute little guys. So that's the first method. So that's what's shown in the pattern. So the instructions are here. It's pretty clear. Neither method is complicated, but just remember these edges will be bias because you're cross-cutting diagonally through your fabric. So when you're sewing these squares, your straight of grain's up and down. So anytime you cut diagonally through your fabric, that creates what they call bias. So see how it's super stretchy. Or use a lot of starch spray. You can use Best Press, Flatter, combination of any of the two. Use some starch as you press and then trim, just so that those little bias edges don't get all crazy on you, because they do have more give than say a traditional method. So that's just my warning with this method, is that is the downfall of it, is that stretchiness. But you do get 4 of them per square versus the other method I'll show you where you're only going to get 2. So the other method, what I ended up doing, anytime I do a half square triangle my way, whatever measurement I want, so we want it 2.5 inches per the pattern, I cut my squares 3 inches because we have to give some seam allowance for the project. So you just take 2 3-inch squares, one of them's print, one's background. I left myself squares this time, and place them right sides together. The beauty of my background is it's essentially double-sided. It doesn't matter which way it goes. So you put your fabrics right sides together, and you will see I have a diagonal drawn on my background. So you will want a diagonal line, and what will happen is you're just going to sew 1/4 inch on either side. Let's see if I can get this close enough for you guys. So you'll see my seam is 1/4 inch from either side of that drawn line. You will then go to your cutting mat once you sew both sides and then cut it apart to get your triangles. So just looks like the other ones. They're just half square triangles. You just only get 2 per this method versus the 4, but I do not have bias edges. These edges, because I cut through the center of my square, my bias really is where the seam is, and the seam's going to keep it sturdier. It's going to keep it from stretching. So I have nice straight edges, not bias. My bias is all under control in my seam here, so I don't have to worry about it as much. And then you just take it, you press it open. Same thing, I'm always pressing my seams open. I haven't changed that at all. And then you end up with these cute little 2.5-inch half square triangles. And since I have 5 of them that are in kind of a rainbow order that I only need 2 of each, I definitely did this method because I didn't need 4. 4 would have been wasteful. So 3-inch square if you're doing them 2 at a time. Okay, make notes. 3 inches on your background, 3 inches on your print. Just draw that diagonal line, sew on either side of the diagonal line, cut it apart, press it, trim to 2.5. Trim, trim, trim. If you don't trim when you're done, they're not going to work because they're going to be too big, and then you're going to be upset later on. So make sure you trim them, check them to 2.5. You should be fine. You should have plenty. You should have to trim around. You should have excess, and you'll be okay. That way you don't have to worry how fat or skinny that seam is. And then remember, if you're doing the one where you're getting 4, if you're doing the one per the pattern, because you need to mass produce them. I did have some colors that needed to be mass produced. Those ones I did at 4.5. I added that 1/2 inch because I just like room to trim, and it gave me definitely enough room to trim, but if I had done 4 inches, I was a little concerned that mine would not have turned out. So if you have already cut 4 inches, try it. Don't throw them away. Just try at least one. Do your 1/4 inch seam all the way around, cross cut them, press them, make sure they're 2.5. Now, if they're not 2.5 and you've already cut your fabric out, you could just try doing your seam skinnier. So just maybe do an 1/8 inch seam versus the quarter. Just make that really super scant seam if you just need a skosh more room uh, for those half square triangles if you've already cut everything 4 inches. Try to make it work. If it just doesn't work, then yes, unfortunately, they go in the orphan pile and start over instead of getting really frustrated and upset because we like happy quilting. That's how it is. And I'm not winning today at my house. So thankfully, I'm at the end. So they're out, and I'm pretty much out. And I'm going to go to a room. If anybody has any questions, I can show you more in detail. I can answer questions. But otherwise, hopefully, have a good Friday, have a good weekend, and happy stitching.